Well, hello everybody. This is Hal,
And this is Melanie.
and we want to welcome you to another episode of Making Biblical Family Life Practical. And we've done a couple of episodes recently kind of aiming at people who are new to homeschooling or thinking about homeschooling or considering
Which there are a lot of, Hal.
You know, our state just released their data for the year, and they said that during the 2019 to 2020, or I guess it was 2020 to 21 school year, the past school year increased the number of homeschoolers by 19%,
Wow.
which our state had a lot to begin with.
Well, and we're seeing that across the nation. The Census Bureau figures just absolutely blew me away.
Mm-hmm.
We saw like the small end of the spectrum. Some states saw growth of 6 or 7%. Some saw growth of upwards of 20%.
And when you're talking about 20% in a state like North Carolina, who has a lot to begin with, that's a big number. But if you're talking about a state like, Maine or Vermont, which doesn't have a large number to begin with, and then they see their numbers double or triple, that's really significant. And so, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things, somebody asked a question and wanted to discuss what is the difference between homeschooling and school at home.
Well, I had to laugh, Hal, when
Yeah.
you sent me your notes for this session.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was thinking when you sent me the title that you suggested that we do
Mm-hmm.
were like two polar opposite things.
Okay.
And so I think we're going to have to discuss this in two segments.
Well, all right.
Because there's kind of two issues here.
Mm-hmm.
There's the legal and situational and all the exterior to your home part of what's the difference.
Right.
And then there's what's the difference day to day.
Well, in either case, though, I think we can agree right off the bat that the critical part maybe not the location so much, because a lot of people, frankly, a lot of new homeschoolers, I think, are coming into this because they've just spent the past year watching Zoom classes from the public school system and watching over their kids' shoulders and thinking, we can do better than this.
Well, and I remember some of them saying, homeschooling is awful. We've been doing that for 3 months. And I thought, no, you haven't been homeschooling.
You've been
doing public school at home.
Right. And you know what? And that's not, we think the pandemic, but that's not a new thing because for years there's been a program in Alaska that's servicing all of these kids out in the remote areas where there's just not enough children and the roads are not reliable and the rest of it. It doesn't make sense to have a publicly funded schoolhouse and staff for this very remote, very thinly populated area. So they've had remote learning in Alaska.
That's been going on a long time in different parts of the world that are remote. For example, the Australian outback.
I remember reading about that when I was a child.
Yeah, where they had school by shortwave radio.
Right. Right. So delivering instruction to a remote location, which happens to be somebody's home, is not a new idea, but I think you can look at those and say, if you are delivering the product of the school system to somebody's home, that's basically taking school to the house.
And there are some advantages just to that because kids are in a more natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
They're interacting with different ages, not so much during the pandemic, but they're interacting with different ages. They're not having to sit in their desk for hours at a time. There are some advantages just to taking instruction out of the institution and putting it into the home, even if it is school at home.
I remember when we first started, basically we're two different groups, who they say, why are you homeschooling? Either they were doing it for an ideological reason. They wanted to give their values, their religious beliefs or whatever to their children, or else they were doing it for what they called pedagogical reasons to say, I'd like to give them a different educational experience. So it's either, an academic emphasis or a moral religious emphasis. But then you know what? After a round of school shootings, suddenly you started seeing more and more people saying, I'm worried about my kids' safety. I don't like the environment in the school system. There's drugs, there's gangs, there's bullying, there's negative peer pressure, and I want my kid out of that.
Well, I heard a lot of people saying last spring that after their kids got home and realized they would not be going back that year,
Mm-hmm.
they told their parents they'd been bullied, and the parents had no idea. I think about Candace Duggar, A Bully Broken Redeemed.
Yes.
She talks about that and the devastating things they went through in their family because their child was being bullied and they had no idea. And so I think as people have gotten their kids home
Right.
and been able to really hear them in a place of safety,
Mm-hmm.
they found out that things were not going well in the socialization aspect of school.
Yeah. So I guess you could say right at the start, if you're doing school at home, there's still some benefits to that over sitting in the institutional setting.
Yeah, because
But
it's not really the place that defines homeschooling. Well, for example, we travel many months out of the year. We school in our van and in hotel rooms
mm-hmm.
and in on campsites. We school all over the place.
We kind of take the approach that life is a field trip.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
what is it that defines school at home versus homeschool? What is homeschooling?
Okay. Well, um,
I think there's two issues.
well, I look at it from kind of a policy wonk perspective, because that was sort of what I was dealing with when we were on the board of our state organization and talking with other board members in different states. And we kind of looked at it and said, there's two issues that really set it apart. One of them is who has the day-to-day control over the educational process and who is going to pay the bills for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's, what we would say true homeschooling looks like starts off with being it's privately funded. It's not something that is getting a constant infusion of tax dollars to make it happen.
And why is that important? Because of the second part,
Mm-hmm.
because he who has the gold makes the rules.
Well,
That
if you're using public money, there are public goals that have to be addressed, and so so the day-to-day control resting with the parents rather than with an outside authority. That to me is a real distinctive of true homeschooling.
right,
It's not so much the location as the focus of control.
right.
So
The academic policy, the
mhm.
curriculum, the teaching style, that's all decided by the parents. And that even applies when you participate in outside classes and co-ops. Because when the parent is the final authority, says, no, we're not gonna do that, or, this is the grade that's going on your transcript. When the parent's in charge, then
Mhm.
it's kind of like you contracted out some of your teaching.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't think if you hired a tutor to help your child understand a subject that maybe you're not comfortable explaining. Say you hired a tutor to teach calculus to your high schooler. If they were in the local public high school, that wouldn't change their status as a public school student that they
Right.
had a tutor
Exactly.
coming in to help them. And likewise, if you say, "Hey, I'd like somebody to come in and teach my child French. I don't speak French, but I know a native of France who would love to teach French to my kids." Hiring them to come in and work as a tutor or to put your kid in private class of some sort, that doesn't change the fact that you are homeschooling. That's just you farmed out some part of that process.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And so it comes down, true homeschooling
Hmm.
is privately funded,
Hmm.
controlled by the parents,
Right.
led
Right.
by the parents. The parents don't have to teach every single thing, but it's led by the parents.
Hmm.
And, I do understand that we have lots of friends that participate in charter schools,
Hmm.
and I understand the motivation. But let's talk for a minute about why homeschooling independently makes a difference to our kids.
Okay.
Because if you use charter school dollars to pay for your curriculum,
Hmm.
then you have to use a secular curriculum,
That is just, and that's a matter of law.
right?
I mean, that's not a big bad school policy. That is a matter of actual federal law.
And that has not always been true.
Well, but I mean, the charter school movement that grew up back in the, I guess, 80s and 90s as it
Hmm.
started, that was one of the things that they had to wrestle through because a lot of times they're looking for classroom space, and what better place to find a classroom than a Sunday school building that's only being used on the weekend? And so there were a lot of them that said, yeah, we'd like to use your classrooms to run a school during the week, and churches were willing to work with that. But the federal government said, look, you've got to you got to take any religious imagery out of the picture. You've got to put away the hymn books. You've got to cover up the posters with Jesus' name on it or anything like that. And so they really got very particular about that. And I know that we have seen that in some of the things that we have done in our business and some that others have done, some of our friends have done in their publishing business. If they're dealing with charter school customers, they have to be very specific. This piece of stuff does not have any sectarian contact. Yeah. And so they have to be very specific to say this is not a religious item that I'm selling.
But it's not just though. That's important that you have to use secular curriculum if you use charter school money. Another issue though is that when we put someone else in charge of our kids' education, then we lose the ability to make the decisions. When we put someone else as authority of our kids' education, if we look and we say, you know what, this child needs to be taught on a different level in a different subject, that may be a problem. Yep. If you think, this child, you know what, this child needs special help, and so I'm going to get them a curriculum for struggling learners. I know one charter school told me that they can't do that without appropriate testing and approval. It limits your options. And that's one of the beautiful things about homeschooling is we can do exactly what our kids need when they need it. And so if our educational choices, it may save us money in the short term, but it may cause us problems in the long term.
Well, or if it doesn't cause an active problem, it may be that you miss out on opportunities.
Yeah.
You have an opportunity cost. Some of our listeners who've been looking at the laws in their local states are saying, now look, it's nice to talk about independence and all the rest of that, but you got to understand, our state, they have an annual testing requirement. We've got to document attendance and 180 days of instruction a year and all. I don't have this ultimate freedom.
It's not as hard as you think.
Well, no, because it's just like, we talk about having freedom of movement in our country. We can go wherever we want to. That doesn't mean I can turn off the highway and drive across a farmer's field. If it's a shortcut, there are rules of the road. There are some guidelines in there that we're expected to follow.
Well,
but
in our state, we're required to to teach for 180. No, actually, it's not 180 days. The rule in our state is that you have to give 9 months of instruction, excluding reasonable vacations. It's not even 180 days.
Yeah.
And it says on the form, please note days on which academic instruction or academic activities take place.
Well, that doesn't
For most of us, that's most days.
That's life.
And there's no limit for how many. There's no standard of how many hours we're supposed to teach or what curriculum we're supposed to use.
Oh no, and they don't care if you want to have school 7 days a week and then take off extended periods, or if you want to have school from 8 p.m. till midnight every day. If you want to do that, you're free to do it. It's not. You've got a lot of flexibility within even the minimal guidelines that they do put out. So just recognizing that it's not a total free form, free range type of thing, but the guidelines that are out there you can work with.
Likewise, testing. If you have a struggling learner, you're allowed to make accommodations. Very few states even have a requirement of what kind of scores you're supposed to have on the test. And when they do, they're not difficult to meet the requirements at all. So you don't have to worry about the legal requirements. This is something you can do. You can meet those requirements. HSLDA.org is great.
That's the Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
For helping you know exactly what the law really requires. I saw the other day a parent in Virginia sent their notice of intent into the school board, and the school board sent back asking for a whole list of things. And this mom contacted HEAV, the Home Educators Association of Virginia, the state support group in Virginia, and they said, no, you have done what is required by law. Here's how you should answer. And she answered that way, and the school board said, okay, thanks, have a good year. But if she hadn't known the law, she would have had to do a whole lot of things that aren't required. How we're running out of time, but in the next segment, I really want to talk about how homeschooling and school look different day to day.
Okay. All right, well, that sounds good. Well, now look, we're following up on a listener question, and that question is, can you tell me what's the difference between homeschooling and school at home? And if you've got a question, it could be about homeschooling, it could be about anything, it could be about
Parenting.
biblical family life, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're about. Just leave us a message on our listener response line. That number is 919-295-0321. Just leave a message and we can answer it, and maybe we can get it onto the podcast. We'd love to get some feedback. So, look, we will come back. The next segment, we'll be talking more about this, more about what it looks like from day to day, okay?
All right, you can find us at raisingrealmen.com, our subscription box at craftsmancrate.com, and the archives for this podcast at halandmelanie.com/radio.
And on that note, I'm Hal.
And I'm Melanie.
And thanks for listening.
Take care, y'all.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Making Biblical Family Life Practical with Hal and Melanie Young. If you found this program interesting, challenging, and encouraging, why not join us on the web at halandmelanie.com. That's HALANDMELANIE.com. Or follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at Facebook/Hal and Melanie or Facebook.com/RaisingRealMen. This program is a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network. Join us next week when we'll be back to talk about making biblical family life practical. Until then, thank you and God bless you for listening.